Hello, and welcome back to What Now on the Threshold of Life, Death, and Grief. I'm here in the studio with my friend and colleague,
Red Keating.
And I'm Julie Brown, and David is not able to be with us, so it's Red and I today. But we're here with two of our other friends and colleagues, so Dr. John Beamish and Dr. Kaetlen Wilson. Welcome.
Welcome. Glad to be here.
Thanks for having us.
So glad to have you both back. You've both been with us before on the podcast. And today we're going to talk about medical assistance in dying and some of the specific grief aspects from MAiD. And so we're going to jump into that conversation today. And I'll turn it over to you, Red.
We're going to jump in by asking you, Kaetlen, if you could sort of give us a high-level overview of what MAiD is, the process, how a person accesses it, just so it just sort of gives us a base to start so everyone's on the same footing.
For sure. So MAiD's been legal in Canada since 2016, and there's currently two tracks for MAiD. One track is where death is seen as reasonably foreseeable, and that's considered track one. Track two is where the other criteria are met, which I'll go through in a moment, but death is not seen as reasonably foreseeable. So to be eligible for MAiD in Canada, you need to be over the age of 18. You need to have what's called an advanced state of irreversible decline, which basically means you've lost a lot of your abilities and you're quite far in the progression of your illness, whatever it is, as an underlying disease. As I said, natural death reasonably foreseeable for track one, not for track two. You need to have suffering, and the suffering is not defined as just physical. It's also emotional suffering, mental suffering, existential suffering. If all the criteria are met, then the process is you have two assessments. Assessments are done either by a nurse practitioner or a physician, and these are two independent assessments. If both assessors feel that you qualify, they'll make a determination whether you qualify for track one or track two. The vast majority of cases in Canada are track one. And then that means that you're eligible to have a MAiD provision if you choose to do so. At no point after or during any of the process are you obliged to go ahead with MAiD. Some people want to get assessed so that they feel a sense of control and a sense of if their suffering is not something that can be relieved by any method of palliative care, or if their quality of life is such that it doesn't have significant value to them, that they can make the decision to go ahead with MAiD. There's certainly a fair number of people who have assessments, are deemed eligible, and then go ahead and die a natural death. But then there's obviously a large number of folks that do choose a provision date right up until the moment that the MAiD provision or procedure starts. The person's eligible to change their mind. And I do MAiD in the community, so at people's homes or hospice. There's also MAiD done in most hospitals in Canada as well.
And I feel like we should just take a moment to acknowledge, there's been a lot around mental health and MAiD, and I know that's a very evolving scenario, but I do have people asking about just what's happening. So could you just comment on that briefly?
Sure. It's still making its way sort of through the processes. It's been deemed that it's a human right to have access to MAiD, regardless of your diagnosis. So it was felt that you can't say somebody can't have MAiD assessments and provisions because their underlying diagnosis is mental health. So that will change. It's not yet changed. But in the not too distant future, that will be another stream for MAiD.
We always talk about MAiD as a new way to die here. We've heard that before. It might not be so new as it was a few years ago, but I did just a little bit of looking, and it said the stats are up to 2003, so we don't have anything past them, but there was 15,343 deaths by MAiD in Canada in 2003. Sorry, 2023.
Yeah.
This is me. which only represents 4.7. And I was wondering, is that high or is that low? I saw that number and I went, I'm not sure what that number represents to me, but 4.7% of all deaths were made in Canada. It seemed low in my mind, but I'm not sure.
I think the most relevant part of that statistic is to look at the growth year over year. So it's increasing a fair amount each year. I can't give you the numbers off the top of my head. I know in provinces where MAiD programs are more established, specifically BC, I think the percentage is closer to 10%. So there's definitely some regional differences. Part of it has to do with the availability of assessors and providers. In smaller areas, rural areas, it's a lot harder to get assessments done.
But I think it's fair to say that Canada's tracking the same trajectory that we've seen in Europe, where it's been available for longer. And there it's ending up around 1 death in 10.
That's still enough. That's a big enough number for us to be having this conversation in regard to how has MAiD and death from MAiD affected how we grieve and the dynamics around that process.
And I think even though the numbers, I hear what you're saying, the numbers is still the minority of deaths in Canada are through MAiD, but because it is relatively new, not only in terms of medically, but also in terms of what people feel comfortable talking about with other people and what supports are out there, and just a sense of people getting their bearings after a MAiD death about how are they to process this grief, because it does feel a little bit different.
Yeah, so let's dive into talking a little more specifically about some of the things we're seeing, and certainly that the literature and research is referring to as well. So we often might use the term in the field that this can be, not always, a disenfranchised grief. And so just for the purposes of our conversation, I thought I would just give definition that's commonly used, and it's by Kenneth Doka. And his definition is the grief experienced by those who incur a loss that is not or cannot be openly acknowledged, publicly mourned, or socially supported. And he refers to suicide and drug overdose, of course, is one of them. But he also writes about how assisted dying, in some cases, has been classified as a disenfranchised grief.
Yeah, I think in popular culture, MAiD is celebrated, and probably rightly so, as an expression of the individual's own ability to take control of their life. And we celebrate that. But there's a paradox, because while as a family and a loved one, you're celebrating the fact that your loved one has had this control and been able to make a choice, internally you're feeling horrible. You're feeling devastated. You're feeling grief. And we haven't allowed that paradox to be talked about and explored, and allow the people who are left after a MAiD death to fully express the degree of loss and pain that they experience.
Okay, so I'm just thinking here on the spot. So are we talking about, on one hand, because sometimes our human minds like to operate kind of in this very binary system, that we're thinking, well, because mom chose it and it was what she wanted, therefore maybe the grief shouldn't maybe be so intense, or we should all maybe feel better about that. Is that some of what you're getting at?
Absolutely.
Right.
Because they made a choice, why are we upset because they made their choice?
Right.
And yet, at an experiential level, we're torn up with grief and have no place to put that grief, because we feel as though expressing that grief is somehow a betrayal of our loved ones' independence and their ability to control their own life and make their own decisions.
Right.
Yeah, I think that's very, very true. And I think there's another level as well that makes it even more painful, which is often family members are in a position of advocating for their loved one to get through the assessments, because there are different processes involved in terms of making the calls, arranging the assessments, getting the paperwork done. So that often is something, it's directed by the patient, but there's actual work involved by the loved one to do that. So in a way, I think they can feel like they're facilitating something that they don't actually, they might cerebrally believe that, yes, they want their mom, in this example, to have a choice. They don't want to have to say goodbye, but they're actually helping move the process along to respect what their mom wants. But in fact, that hastens getting to a destination that they don't want to get to.
And there's guilt involved with that somehow I helped facilitate this, and you are not permitted to talk about that.
Right. So on one hand, it's like it was an act of love and caring to help mom navigate to honor her wishes, right? To be able to act on her own agency around this. But then we're left with this, again, like dissonance in us that, oh, but I help facilitate this.
Mm-hmm. Help facilitate something I didn't want, and something that I may not have been 100% behind because of that. I don't want to be thrown into this grief sooner than I need to be or would be. And so I'm really supporting something that I'm not sure I support. And therefore I'm really conflicted now about how to respond to that, because I had to support my loved one through a process that I wasn't necessarily ready to fully engage and support.
I think that's harder if you don't fully support it. But I think even if you fully support the person's right to choose, that doesn't make it any easier to say goodbye. Mm-hmm. And often, because it's still fairly political, I think family members are often in a position of, when, for example, if they talk to people about their mom having MAiD, I think they're often very careful to try and champion it a little bit, which again doesn't leave a lot of space for their grief. And if it's not uniformly supported by all the family members, then that adds a whole other level. It's the element of choice that is actually, I think, paradoxically wonderful for patients to have, but very hard for family to metabolize.
One of the dilemmas is around the choice. And it's that in a quote, natural death, you have no choice. It happens. Mm-hmm. But with MAiD, there is an element of choice. And while the adult part of our brain can get our head around that and the individual's right to choice, there's that little childlike part of us inside that says, but you chose to leave me. When that surfaces, there's intense grief, intense guilt, and true anxiety because you feel conflicted.
It's like an attachment panic.
It's an attachment
Mm-hmm.
panic.
Yeah.
It's an attachment panic. And I don't know that we know the solution to it, but a start is to allow it to be talked about. Mm-hmm. And I think, to Kaetlen's point, MAiD has been so political, it's been almost verboten to have these types of discussions.
Mm-hmm. One of the things I frequently hear is that desperation, and I think this is what you're getting at, John, is it's like, okay, well, we knew the day was coming. We could see, okay, let's say it's mom. We could see mom was declining. We set the date. It happened. And then instantly there's this question of, but we could have had more time.
Yes. Yeah.
Right? I could still have my mom right now. And of course, when we're in attachment panic and deep pain, we would take anything, 3 more days, 3 more hours. And so it's this idea, it can feel like, again, intellectually, I knew this was coming. Maybe it was even agreed upon. Maybe we were all in sync about it. But then still there can be a sense of this is wrong because I could have still had her for more time. And so sometimes I find in my office what we're doing is helping the brain metabolize that, because the brain wants to get stuck on maybe I don't have to be in this pain right now because maybe I could still have her. Or maybe I could have, it's attached to the idea that maybe I don't have to be in the awful place I'm in right now because I could have still had her for a little bit longer.
And I find when I speak with people about this, we talk about the amazing thing that the human brain can hold two conflicting ideas at the same time. And that's okay. Mm-hmm. And that's okay. And it is okay to celebrate your loved one's death and the fact that they got to choose and had full agency. At the same time, it's okay to be utterly devastated by the loss and to feel, I wish I had more time. That is okay to be. It's an okay place to be. But we like to be black or white, and we get really upset when we're not one or the other.
And so, like, maybe that's a takeaway from this conversation right now. If you're someone supporting someone, is just to remind them of, we can hold the multiplicity of our experience and all can be true. And especially when we're in a place of pain, it's a contraction. And we will resort to like one way of kind of seeing it. I could have had more time with her, for example. Yeah. So as you say, we were able to honor this, or we were able to, this went as we wanted it to be. And I so wish it had never happened.
Yeah.
And I think there's something in there in the quality of responsibility for the death. Mm-hmm. He says, this was the choice and we supported it, but now am I somehow responsible? Because I was thinking, like, I wish I had more time. We could have had more time. But when someone dies, I hate the word naturally, but let's go that way. You would also say, I wish we had more time. Like I'll take 3 more days, like whatever. But the dynamic inside of MAiD, I think, is there's a hook of some sense of responsibility because of your involvement in the process.
Yeah. To Kaetlen's point.
Yeah.
And there's also the element of control.
Yeah.
That in the, for want of a better term, a natural death, your control is very limited. Whereas with MAiD, you are asserting your control.
The patients also, I think there's, the majority of times, there's quite a difference in terms of what family see as someone is dying with MAiD versus a natural death. Because with a natural death, there's a slow march toward failing and death. And there's lots of visual evidence that families over time, I think, start processing.
You get clues.
And you really see the person diminishing in front of you. Whereas with MAiD, patients, we sort of have this saying that the happiest person in the room is the patient, which is uniformly what we see. Like, patients are deeply grateful and relieved that they can make this choice and leave on their own terms. Like, I have no doubt at all about how wonderful it is for patients, but they often can look a little bit euphoric almost because they know there's an end to their suffering. And I think that's a very hard thing for family to see, because sort of by definition, the person is going out on their own terms and in a way that isn't what we picture when we picture somebody dying. And then the MAiD procedures are it's very painless, it's very quick. And the quickness is also hard for people. That having time at the bedside where you can see and feel and tell that the person is just so close to death that we see with a natural death, you don't have that with MAiD. They're alive, they're joking, they say they love you. They're very, very profoundly present. And then within a matter of minutes, they're gone.
We hear that all the time, don't we, Red? I feel like that is something we're almost always processing with people around a MAiD death is, it was so quick. Even though I knew it was coming, the physician was there, we talked, we said goodbye, and even though they'd been informed to expect it, it's still like really startling.
And I think you get into some of the dynamics of sudden death.
Yes.
that shock, surprise. And again, you feel conflicted because intellectually you know what's going to happen, but emotionally it still is shocking.
And I think it makes people reckon with their own mortality. There's nothing like seeing how alive we can be and then how dead we can be to make you realize the slice between the two is so thin and vulnerable. It really is. And that's terrifying for people to see.
That existential terror.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And it is highlighted. I mean, yeah, we've spoken to many people who it's just like, we were talking, we were having fun. We had coffee this morning,
yeah.
and then they're gone. Like they got up and they were here 1 second and gone the next, and gone not just to get milk,
yeah.
but gone, and the finality of that moment. I think, and especially if you're watching it, I mean, the other thing that we often hear is that, you know, it's hard not to focus on what's happening in the room because sometimes the only activity is that of the doctor or the nurse practitioner. And so they watch the action. And I always say to folks, focus on your loved one, look them in the eye, pay attention to them, share that last moment, share your love, and don't, you know, almost like the Wizard of Oz, don't pay any attention to that guy behind the curtain. But we're drawn to movement and we're drawn to action. Yeah. And I think that I know I've spoken to many people where that combination of being fixated on the procedure and then how quick it was really had an impact on that sense of here this moment, gone the next. And then the time that they didn't have, that they could have had if the choice hadn't been made for MAiD.
Yeah. And adding on to Kaetlen's point, you've spoken about this in other podcasts, the importance of vigil and sitting vigil and how healing that can be and how therapeutic that can be. That doesn't happen. You know, those quiet hours where you're just sitting at the bedside processing, that's not happening. You may be very busy and you may be intellectually preparing, but that emotional space and time passes you by. You don't have that.
One of the things I've seen with that is when you're sitting vigil, it's very fatiguing. And so sometimes family, what you'll start to hear from them that they couldn't have said 3 days or 4 days before is like, okay,
We're ready
now.
to let go.
We're ready to let go.
Yeah.
And so that suddenness of MAiD, even though intellectually, again, they know they don't get that.
Yeah.
I think the vigil piece, just to stick with that for a moment, usually when family are in that vigil period, they're not really interacting with the person they love anymore. They're already starting to separate from them. And with MAiD, family quite uniformly talk about how wonderful and rich and utterly devastatingly exhausting and sad the days, weeks leading up to the date are, because I've heard it referred to as a parade of lasts. So it's like, okay, this is the last time we're going to watch this movie together. This is the last, everything is the last time. So there's a richness there, but it actually, I think, often brings family members closer. And then all of a sudden you have to separate from them, which is, it requires an enormous amount of bravery from family members.
Kaetlen, how much do you see or have you seen where the family is in an alignment with the choice? How much of that do you see? Is it very common from your experience?
It's not uncommon at the beginning. So when I first do an assessment, it's not uncommon to have some element of that. But I find over time, and there's various resources that I recommend families look at to get a better idea about MAiD. I find over time there tends to be more cohesiveness around the decision. I did see some research indicating that when there's a higher level of discordance in the family, that complicates grief for everybody, which makes sense to me intuitively. For the most part, I would say that the core group that's important to the patient usually end up being okay with it, but recognizing that anyone who's not okay with it is not somebody that I then see at the provision. So I don't know that I have a full picture of that.
But it brings up a problem that I think is very real for folks, is that you can't talk about your loss with everybody.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And that's part of disenfranchisement. You can't go and talk, you have to almost feel them out first on the topic of MAiD before you speak to them about your loss. So you feel constrained. Am I okay to talk about this? Am I permitted to have this conversation? Which I think means family members carry a lot more longer.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think a lot of people don't talk about it.
Yeah.
And I think partly when they do speak about it, hopefully less so now, but I'm sure it's still very present, people are curious about MAiD. So then people will go to questions about MAiD and kind of missing the whole point of you're talking to someone who's grieving the person they just lost. Mm-hmm. So they end up being in a role of educating, which again is not helpful to them as they're grieving.
Right. That was perfectly lined up because I had in my head sort of that role of secrecy. There's sometimes in families there's secrecy around the death, and that might be due to sort of social judgment that they fear, sort of, whether that be from other family members, maybe a faith community, where now the death is now a secret. The death has happened, but how the death has occurred is now a secret and no one can talk about it. Yeah. And that's just the definition of disenfranchised grief, that you are now alone in your grief because you can't fully talk about it.
It's a little bit analogous to suicide. I mean, I think we're getting better about permitting those discussions. But 10, 20 years ago, those discussions, you couldn't socially have those discussions. And so you were alone with that grief. Well, I think we're going to evolve with MAiD as well. But I do think we're at a point where there is a bit of social constraint about talking about it. And to Kaetlen's point, people don't get to your grief. They want to know about the mechanics.
And what are you all seeing around the secrecy part? Because I have a few scenarios running through my head where maybe the family all knew, but then it was identified by the patient, but we don't want anyone else to know, right? Like, or these people can know, but not those people can know. Do you see much of that?
Yeah, I think that's still very much present. And it saddens me because I think that is definitely an added burden for everybody. And it's hard to know, I sort of say the usual stuff about that it's legal and, there's nothing shameful, and, reassure them that there's no negative implications of having a MAiD death. Often people worry about, will it affect their insurance or will it affect their home value? There's all sorts of concerns people have, and none of those are anything to worry about. It doesn't affect your insurance. It's not MAiD. The fact that the person died with MAiD doesn't even go on the death certificate. Their underlying cause of death goes on the death certificate. But I would say that there is still a fair degree of secrecy around it.
I mean, I've seen situations where it's secrecy amongst family members, where some, let's say it's a parental situation, some of the children know, and then there's some that don't.
Right.
And they're trying to protect the secrecy of the death. And I just kind of go, but that kind of stuff is going to pop out somewhere. And this now, you're almost delaying another family crisis. And the fear is that if you told the person that we're not telling, is they'd tell everybody.
Right.
And so now we're keeping a secret inside a family because one person would probably be a bit of a mouthpiece and wouldn't keep the secret. And now the family has their grief and the secret against, family members that aren't aware of the nature of the death.
So they're walking alone with their grief.
And under such pressure.
They're under pressure and they're very alone with it. And they don't have permission to speak about their grief.
but then someday they will, and it will pop out by mistake, and that other family member will be there, or they'll hear something from somebody else. And then, I mean, it might not. We've got to leave that as an option too. But if it does, then it's just going to complicate the grief even more. Yeah. And divide the family potentially, right?
Yeah. Hopefully that's a minority.
Hopefully.
Yeah.
Hopefully. But that's the ones we see, right?
Right. Yeah.
we don't get to see the people who had a loved one die with MAiD, and everybody was great and everyone was happy. They don't come. They're okay.
Well, but maybe that in itself is a problem, because they feel they have to be okay. They feel the social expectation is to be okay, and they can't express and work through their grief because somehow they feel that's selling the person who chose MAiD short.
So true. Like you hear things like, well, he went out on his own terms. Like this is the way he lived. And so, we have to just be, they don't use the word glad, but we're just glad that, dad could choose it that way. Or you're right, John. And it's like another form of like emotional bypassing that we do. And we're so good at that already in the grief world, right?
And they're not allowed to let the other shoe drop and say, but I feel horrible.
Yeah.
My dad just died.
Yeah. I know it's what dad wanted. And I'm really struggling with it.
And the fact he got what he wanted doesn't lessen my pain.
Yes.
And we have trouble acknowledging that.
Yes.
Yeah.
One of the very positive things, and it came out of the difficulty people have talking about their MAiD grief, is that there's two organizations. One is Bridge C14, and the other is MAiD Family Support, that have peer-to-peer support for grief. So that's a resource that is increasingly used by family members after they've been part of a MAiD death. And you do hear people talking about like that feels like the safest because it's another person who's walked this journey, and there'll be differences, but there's a lot of commonality by virtue of it having been a MAiD death. So that's, I think, a really positive development. And that MAiD Family Support organization was started by a woman who, after she experienced a MAiD death with her father, she just couldn't find the resources. She found that she was always trying to feel out, even with professionals, mental health professionals, like what was their stand on MAiD before she could open up. So I think that's a very positive resource for people.
One of the things Kaetlen and I commented on when we were talking about this earlier is that the literature is not very rich yet. This is all so new. And the first pieces coming out are more case reports, short-term questionnaires. But the in-depth research and the richness of time, like what does MAiD death, what's the impact on grief 5 years down the line, 10 years down the line? We don't have that yet.
Yes,
so
I noticed that.
A lot of this is still very speculative, and it will be interesting to see what happens as time passes.
Do you have any guesses if you're willing to be brave enough to throw your guess out?
I hope that we give permission for the ambivalence to be acknowledged and not seen as a problem to be worked through, but a journey to be walked.
What about you, Kaetlen? Do you want to throw out a guess around what we might see or what you would hope to see?
I think I agree with John, what John's saying. I would also add that I think as all of us get older, I think it becomes easier for people to understand the choices that were made by the person who chose MAiD. Because I think until you have experience of losing your ability to do things, it's pretty hard to understand why somebody would choose to end their life sooner than they might have if they'd gone with a natural death. But I think once you start experiencing losses of your own abilities, whatever you find meaningful, I think that's going to maybe make it more real for people why the person seemed to make a choice, but in a lot of ways they didn't really have a choice. They did what they felt they had to do.
And I think the literature is pretty clear on that. If you look at the profile of people who choose MAiD, it is people for whom control is a very high life value. Mm-hmm. They value control almost over every other aspect of their
autonomy.
life. And autonomy. Autonomy and control. And if those are lost, and you understand the importance of those to them, you begin to understand why they would choose MAiD.
What else are you seeing that we haven't maybe talked about? What other kind of dynamics do we see in the family in the lead up to or afterwards that maybe we haven't given words to yet?
Well, the one, and it's a roadblock, I don't know the way around it yet, is how do you explain MAiD to children? It's, we haven't sort of really developed a way to do that. And that's, how do you tell grandchildren?
So true. And going back to the secrecy part of the conversation, is that's where I've seen some of the secrecy come out.
Absolutely.
Is, well, these people in the family are going to know, but not these people because those are the children or those are the people close to the children. But then, of course, what happens as those children grow? To your point, Kaetlen, we're all kind of making sense out of all of our losses as we grow, as we transition through our own developmental milestones. Mm-hmm. Do you see that, Kaetlen?
Which aspect?
The like, how do we talk to children, or does that come up in your assessments?
There are good guidelines from our professional organization on how to communicate with kids about MAiD. And I suspect it's like most things communicating with kids. They take their cues from us. And I think if we're honest, and it doesn't mean it's going to be easy for them to absorb, but I don't think it makes it intrinsically more complicated.
And you tailor it to their developmental stage.
Yeah. I wonder about, in the question about if there are other pieces, there is an interesting piece, I think, about dying at home. Now, this doesn't differentiate natural death from MAiD death, but it does differentiate a home death from a hospital death. I'm often struck by, there's so much for families to do immediately, right after the person dies. Mm. And I wonder if in a hospital they're buffered by that a little bit. It just seems like they almost have to. I encourage them to, there's no hurry to call the funeral home. They can take time with their loved one who's now deceased, but it almost seems like they have to spring into action.
Are you saying they feel compelled to spring into action? There's lots they have to do.
Yeah.
But do they feel a pressure to do that?
And maybe part of it is that it's not the cultural norm to just sit with a dead body.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Because it often amazes me how, and I understand that that's a lot. Most people will not have seen a dead person, but there does seem to be this sort of compulsion to keep everything moving. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I always just really hope that when the person does let their sadness out, they have someone with them.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know if this is right, but when you were talking there, Kaetlen, I'm thinking it's a task-oriented process, so you just keep going on with the tasks.
Yeah,
right?
I think
this is the next step. This is the next step, and there's no place then for the exhale and the just it's stopped. Now we can just be. And the other piece, I think, too, people are not used to having deceased dead bodies in their homes the way they did 100 years ago with the wake in the parlor and all of that kind of stuff. But I wondered if there's anything about the task orientation of the death. There's assessments, there's dates, then there's the procedure, then there's now we got to get the funeral home in.
Right.
And it's I don't want to say it's a checklist, but maybe it has that component to it.
Yeah, I think the family and for us as providers, I think it is really important on that point to try and encourage and leave space for ritual among the tasks, because it's both.
Yeah.
Do any of you have an example of what a ritual has looked like, or what you has seen as served a family well?
I think that we are all a little bit individual in terms of how we organize things around provisions. For myself, there's a sort of a half hour between when I first arrive. I think there's always, tremendous build up for everybody, kind of to the point where I'm going to arrive. And then I touch base with the patient, confirm if they want to go ahead, see how the family's doing, go through again what people are going to be seeing and answer any questions. And then I tell them it's going to take me about a half an hour to organize the medications. And then I step out and go to another room. But often I can hear what's happening because I'm in people's homes. And I think that half hour is sort of on top of what people are picturing. And I think that that's important. It just feels to me like people need to have that little extra bit of time. And people do different things. I mean, I've seen people read poems. Often people have music playing, which is just beautiful and heartbreaking. But mostly people are having like those profound connection moments when you know that the hourglass is on the last bits of sand. I mean, it's beautiful to bear witness.
That half hour makes it real.
Because I'm there.
You've gone from the theoretical
Yes.
to the reality. This is happening.
It
and it's
is,
happening
yes.
now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it
Well
is.
put.
It's a sacred time.
Yeah.
It's a special walled off time.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say, you must feel the intensity of love that you must feel in those spaces. Yeah.
Absolutely. And for the most part, it is love. I mean, it's like any other grief and loss. If things were not okay before, that still continues to be not okay at the last moments.
Thank you. I think that's really important to say.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. It doesn't, change the trajectory that people have been on. And there's a lot of humor often, which is amazing.
Although we use humor to deflect.
Well, it's usually, yeah, it's true. I mean, I've had some really great, funny patients, but yeah, I think that the part for me that makes me at peace with doing MAiD work is just that moment of looking at the patient when I confirm if they want me to go ahead. Because it's so clear that they do want to go ahead. Like, it's just so, it's amazingly unequivocal, even though they are also saying goodbye to all the people they love.
Yeah.
Like, people know when it's their time to leave and defined by them of what their time is. Yeah.
I'm putting you on the spot, so you may not want to answer this. Do you have a ritual for yourself when you leave the home?
I do, in the sense that I never just go on to other work. Like, I always protect the time after and just sort of do all the things that I do to ground myself. Yeah. It's kind of hard work and not hard work at the same time. Yeah. Yeah. But I'm honored to do it, for sure.
How do you see it fitting into the continuum of palliative care, or how do those two come together, or do they?
I think palliative care as a discipline is changing. 5-10 years ago, there was a firm line. Palliative care was on one side, MAiD was on the other side. I do think that palliative care is evolving and recognizing that MAiD is a legitimate choice for some people, and that we can walk alongside them in a palliative sense. as they go down that journey, that we don't have to leave them. There was a time when, well, if you chose MAiD, your palliative physician pulled back. And I think that is changing. So we'll walk that journey with you just as we would walk any other journey towards death with you. And I hope that continues.
Yeah, I would agree. I would say more than 50% of my referrals come from palliative physicians. Several of the palliative physicians will do one of the assessments, which is great for patients because the palliative docs already know the patient. And there's a lot of collaboration back and forth. So, and I would say that I have seen that evolve. I started in 2019. So in the 6 years I've been doing it, I've seen that evolve. So I think that's great for patients. It ends up being better care for them for sure.
It's no longer seen as being a betrayal of the palliative philosophy, which there was a time when I think it was expressed that way. And it's no longer seen as being inconsistent with good palliation.
And we do MAiD at hospice.
Yeah.
So as we begin to wrap up our conversation, what haven't we talked about? What haven't we or we want to circle back to and just highlight again?
I would like the families who have been part of the MAiD process to feel that they're allowed to be ambivalent, they're allowed to be angry, they're allowed to be sad, that it is not a betrayal of their loved one's independence and the choice they made.
Yeah, I think that's beautifully put. I would encourage them, family members, to, like, a lot of the focus that we do as assessors and providers, our primary relationship is with the patient who's going to be having MAiD if they choose to go ahead. I think we all try and help and attend to families as much as we can, but I would really encourage family members to reach out early to something like MAiD Family Support to get some peer-to-peer support as they're going through the process. Because I know from families, but also from a good friend of mine whose mom had MAiD, that it's really, really hard. Each step is really, really hard for families. Yeah.
And on that note, I would add, continuing that, I find people need to debrief the MAiD death. And what I have found with some clients, it can almost be like a bit of a trauma response in the brain, that moment of death, that the suddenness that we talked about. And I have found that people need to debrief it, talk about it. Not everyone's going to be comfortable, of course, maybe in your circle to do that, but I would really encourage people to, like, not just tell someone, but like debrief it. Here's what I was thinking. Here's what I was feeling. Here's what surprised me. Here's what scared me. Here's what I didn't expect. Here's what, maybe there was humor, or maybe there was something else that was surprising. And I find for me, when I am walking somebody through that debriefing, it's just naming things, like naming the emotion that went with that. So did that feel scary, or did that feel confusing, or was that shocking? Yes, it was shocking. Okay, right. And that I find that can really help kind of metabolize that memory. One of the things I've noticed doing MAiD grief work is sometimes that's my first work with people, is just to help them metabolize that memory so that then we can go on to do some of the grief support work. Yeah.
And would you say there's a good time for that? Like, I'm wondering how I can support people, or is it too, obviously we always sit with families after and ask them if they have any questions and explicitly state if things went well, that was very smooth and they didn't have any pain. But it feels to me almost too soon, like people are pretty...
Yeah. I was going to say, and I'll be interested to hear what the rest of you... I notice it showing up several weeks out.
Right.
And they'll start to say, like, I'm looping on that moment of the needle, or I'm looping on this specific moment. And they can actually, and they'll say, I feel like my brain's kind of frozen in that moment. And doesn't often happen in the hours and the days immediately the death.
Yeah.
But that also happens with other kinds of death too. Like you see that. But I do find there's something specific about the MAiD death as opposed to like the visual death and watching the body die that can be particularly jarring to the brain.
I would concur with that. Yeah, immediately after, there's just too soon.
Yeah.
Because I think no matter what the death is, there's the shock, there's the disbelief, there's instant sort of fogginess, that happens because the world has changed in a way that you could never have anticipated, and it's only seconds later, and you're not able to process any of that. You are just now in sort of automatic, or I don't want to say robotic, but that sense of now it's just, where am I? And it takes time for you to come back down, for the fog to clear, and for your thoughts to then, and feelings sort of truly surface from wherever they were, sort of smothered by that fog, or that sense of the world having changed so drastically in such a split second. But that same fog exists in all deaths, right? And so it takes a bit of time after.
Makes
sense. For those to surface. Just, I'm curious because I have noticed it propping up in a few obituaries lately, where the death by MAiD is sort of stated in the obituary. And then, this week here in Canada, we had the Robert Munch announcement for some reason. I don't know why that became news. Is that a sign that we're sort of getting a little bit more used to it, or that it's becoming, maybe we're on a road where it will be less disenfranchised? I don't want to say, that this is the panacea, but I've just noticed that the little things are starting to creep in lately.
I think yes. I think that's the other piece I've noticed. I've noticed that in obituaries. I've also noticed that increasingly patients or families will know somebody else who was involved with a MAiD death or had a loved one who had MAiD. And I think that's very, very comforting to them.
So true.
Yeah.
Because not very long ago, people or families were saying, like, they knew no one.
Yes.
True.
So true. Yeah.
No, I do think we're beginning to gently move towards more societal acceptance. Sometimes I think putting that the death was by MAiD in the death announcement is a political statement, back to one of Kaetlen's points, and that's okay. That's a good thing. But it's making the rest of us read that and say, oh, okay, this is going on. This is okay. They seemed okay with it. So I do think that we're gently moving in that direction.
Well, and the polling around Canadian support for MAiD, like, it's very, very high. That people, the vast majority of Canadians are in support of MAiD. I think where the tricky spots are is it's a new kind of grieving that as a society we don't have as much experience with.
Well, thank you so much for both of you, John and Kaetlen. This has been a great conversation. It's another way for us to be having this conversation. It's a new way to die, new-ish way to die. As you just said, it's a new kind of grief where there's new elements. And I think it's through having these kind of conversations that we can help normalize it, which we know is such a big part of the grief process, is normalizing the experience. So thank you both so much for being here.
Most welcome.
Been a pleasure.
Thank you for listening to What Now? On the Threshold of Life, Death, and Grief. What Now is produced in partnership with Hospice Peterborough, dedicated to providing compassionate care and support to individuals and families facing life-limiting illness and loss. What Now is recorded at Thin Spaces Studio in Peterborough, Ontario. Special thanks to Paradise Garage for providing the music. Technical support is provided by Sean Heichert and audio engineering by Kevin Fleming. More episodes of What Now are available for free on most major podcast platforms. If you found value in our conversations, please support us by following, leaving a 5-star review, and sharing with your friends and loved ones. If you'd like to support the essential work of Hospice Peterborough, please consider visiting hospicepeterborough.org/donate. Your contribution helps us to continue to provide vital care and support. Until next time, may you find peace and comfort on your journey.